Welcome to the Exploring the Vintage NFT Space podcast with Zero G, and I'm excited to have today Daniel Friedman, one of the original Curio Cards artists who created 24, 25, and 26. Thanks for having me on, for joining today, Daniel.
Thanks. Really happy to be here. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Um, well, let's kind of get some of your backstory before we get into some other stuff. So let's first off, when did you get into crypto, and what kind of piqued your interest there?
Well, I was going to graduate school in biology at Stanford from 2014 to 2019, and I was learning about different aspects of computer technology. Blockchain was on the rise in finance, but also it was also already interesting to think about how is this technology and other kinds of technologies being used for decision making, for science, and then that was learning about the blockchain side. And in the background, and something we'll assuredly talk about, was drawing and physical art, just pen on paper, pretty much the only media that I return to. And so it's really the juxtaposition of learning about some of the technology side of crypto between about 2015, 16, 17, and beyond, and then just drawing. And I guess where those two things kind of intersect is what leads us to here.
Yeah, interesting. So, yeah, when you started out, the possibilities for crypto back then were pretty much wide open. What actually motivated you to pull the trigger and start playing around with that?
I can't really remember what entered me from the fiat side into
Hmm.
the financial side, but I can probably think about learning about the ways that we already used similar sequential cryptographic systems, for example, in code or the way that some scientific systems work. Seeing that that kind of a system, that kind of a money or just even calculator was being deployed out in the open was just kind of interesting. And I was also thinking more about decentralized systems like ants at the time, and computer networks are decentralized systems. So the blockchain being this kind of like new emergent form of a decentralized computer system that was making headlines and kind of interesting people in different areas around that time was just kind of got me into that. And yeah, I guess it's been a pretty wild ride since then.
Yeah, yeah. There were so many things that were fascinating to me at the time. We had really a lot, like kind of the rise of some of the privacy coins at the time were really starting to take off, like Monero and Zcash. I don't know. There was just a lot of exciting things. We also had like infrastructure projects based on cryptocurrency too, like storage, and you even have some like networking protocols and stuff now too. So there's really a ton of possibilities there. Um,
And one other piece was just the memes and the friends and the kind of peripheral learning and thinking. It was just definitely the ups and the downs, but
mhm.
yeah, it's a fun thing.
Yeah, for sure. It gives us getting in that early kind of gives you perspective too, with all the market volatility, and like helps you keep cool when you see see the price go up and down, right? So as we're recording this, we had one of the biggest moves in Bitcoin in a very long time. We just touched underneath 29,000. Um, this is in 2022, so a big move. Um, Yeah, so that's cool. And so early you got in very early, but when did you find out about NFTs? Was that on Counterparty, or was that Ethereum you first heard about those being a thing?
So I heard about NFT probably around 2018 or 2019, starting to see different kinds of art being offered and didn't actually connect the dots really with Curio. because that had been in 2017, and I guess that'll kind of bring us to Curio and how that fits in. But yeah, learned about it totally not knowing that Curio were NFT and before the rediscovery, and then just learned later that Curio are NFT. And so that's basically been about a year ago. Now it's May 12th, 2022, and the rediscovery was a bit more than a year ago. But before that, I was not really connecting the dots between NFT at all and
Okay.
Curio.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and not just any NFT. Curio is really a groundbreaking project on Ethereum too. So that's well, let's talk a little bit about your background as an artist and how you kind of how you started out and your interest there.
Okay, so I always kind of like to draw and enjoyed keeping my hands busy during classes and school, and then just more and more started to make time to draw between other activities or during other listening activities where drawing was possible, like conversations, and also started to draw a lot more with friends and with people meeting in social situations. And so it was just drawing a lot. And I really love and respect all kinds of art and about how different people kind of bring different parts of their situation and find the way to make art like work for them. So that just kind of makes me think about drawing on trains and taking a lot of train rides around, being in class, like seeing those as opportunities for drawing, open up a lot of drawing time. And pretty much since high school, I've been focusing more on full page drawings. So I guess around 2009, I think, are the first drawings uploaded currently on my Flickr, but hopefully later will be on self-hosted website. But the first upload dates are like in 2009, and so from then through undergraduate and graduate school and continuing now, uh, in different spurts, I've just been doing pen drawings. And the drawings uh, for the cards 24, 25, 26 are like a full page style, which we can talk more about specifically, but kind of in broad strokes. Uh, and the images in the drawing portfolio are all, like uploaded in the order and around the time that they were drawn. And to just kind of provide an overview, I hope that's like okay or contextualizing for some people. The very earliest drawings all are very strongly with symmetry and repetition, 100% black and white. And then there was the introduction of red about several years later, but it's like all black and white and no words at all. Then I started using like red and black pens, just sort of that duality. And then but still within the purely abstracted realm. And then also later started to introduce like occasionally using other colors, and then also especially using text and symbols, which I call font play. So any kind of like one person or multi-person drawing where there's some kind of recognizable text or even kind of in the gray zone would be a symbol, uh, which kind of introduces a different interpretive frame to see any linguistics on the drawing, which we can talk more about, as
Yeah.
opposed to this pure abstractive mode. But yeah, pretty much since then, especially as I seemingly had less and less time, even though I know that this is a total fallacy for doing art, as like in the last few years, I've been a full-time scientist. But um, now I kind of look for more time-bound, symbolic driven drawings, still mostly involving all black and red. But that's the kind of drawing that I've done, and that's, I guess, what we can talk any much you want about.
Sure. Yeah. Can you explain what you mean by time bound?
Time bound being like I set a specific amount of time to complete the drawing, like or a range like within 30 to 60 minutes or within 30 to 90 minutes, I'd like to finish one drawing, or sort of a more just like rapid fire mode drawings that I basically don't scan to the online portfolio, just like scribbling and just like both sides of the piece of paper, just sort of like trying to either draw for a certain amount of time and just make a lot of mark, or try to finish one scannable, like high quality, basically like good to look at drawing in that amount of time. Whereas previously I would like work on carrying around something in my backpack and work on a few drawings and then like take a break, and but always focus on finishing them out, but taking any amount of breaks in between.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a different type of discipline to just commit to only having, like you said, an hour or something to finish a piece.
Yeah, and it just sort of like whatever it is at the end, that's just how it is. And that's kind of like conversations that way. I'm
Mhm.
thinking about things I've already said in this conversation. Oh, well, of course, this could have been said differently. It's like that's the Zoom chain. That's
Mhm.
the MKV chain. It has its own type of record. So just thinking about how when we're drawing, it's also very similar. So that's an aspect I think uh, like a parallel between both blockchain and the conversation and drawing, where like once the mark is made on the paper, more can be added, but it can't be erased with pen. So,
Interesting. Yeah.
but still, attention can be drawn by adding something else, or like thickening something else, or making a different mark. And so you can send transactions later, but you can't undo the transactions that have happened. You can't undo what was actually said, for example. But you can say things later, like, for example, that like any of the specific dates, I literally don't remember all the total details. I'm just chilling, 10 to 15 to 20 years later. So some of these total details might be wrong, but I just that's like I'm adding later. But then how do we actually move forward into the future, given what becomes increasingly fixed in the past, and that now that more and more of our life is being recorded in these digital systems and on and off blockchain.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy. I didn't think of that, but the pen and paper as a medium like definitely does have a parallel to blockchain itself. Like you said, immutable. You can keep adding, but you can't take away the history, which is one of the big strengths of using this as a platform for art as well.
Yes, and even to kind of broaden this network of like things where the past is fixed, like the actions that occur on chain, on page, in the conversation, those actions are fixed. Um, I guess another area that is like that is like science, which we can talk more about, but the past experiments are kind of like the immutable record, and then what people analyze and say about it becomes like hopefully the immutable record. Like the content of a paper can't be changed retroactively, but increasingly we can version things, which helps people be clear about which version of something they were referencing. And then as it might develop, it can still be like traced and caught up with like the most modern version of something, kind of like a software repository. So all of these different systems were like moving forward, making these commitments in the past. So those are all like really interesting things to just think about when talking to friends, drawing, thinking about drawing, talking to chill people like yourself, Zero.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's another good analogy because in science, we literally are standing on the achievements of those that came before us. It's yeah, definitely just a different time scale, really. Um, but yeah, let's dig into your cards first, and then we can kind of talk more about science and some other aspects that are interesting too. Um, so for well, I guess even before we dig into your cards, so I know you were one of the you were an artist that eventually that submitted artwork and joined. Can you talk about how you got involved with Curio and how that process went to submit your art and get accepted?
Yes, so found a Google form and have searched, but have not exactly found how I got that form. in 2017 and filled it out, submitted my art, just a few drawings that looked interesting or coherent in the required format and like the kind of vertical card format, and submitted it, got accepted, and then didn't really get too much follow up. And as far as I knew, the project was just kind of like evaporated. And it was during like the ERC20, ICO, ETH,
Mhm.
Cambrian explosion, Memapalooza, just sort of explosion there. So something, first off, submitting art and not receiving a massive like response or any response, or even having it displayed or posted on someone's website, like it's very rare for a coherent follow-up. So it totally slipped under my radar for several years. So 2017, that was in the middle of graduate school, and then it was in 2021, I think, right, when all of it
Yeah, that's
picked
right.
up. Yeah, so in that situation, so yeah, I mean, I can find the dates of the email or whatever, but people started emailing me and asking if I had Curio Cards, and then I uh, got connected pretty rapidly with Adam McBride, who kind of like semi live like debriefed me and gave me the narrative information management update, gave me the story details of Curio, which was like funny. And yeah, it was just a really surprising onboarding, but then, got
Well,
added a role in a Discord. It was like, oh, okay, yeah, I remember those drawings. I see them on Curio.cards. And then everything that's happened with the community and with all the Curio verse and historical NFTs and everything else kind of developing since then has just this has just been like one thread in that.
well, just to clarify one more point. So did you even know that your work was accepted?
I could look at the email. I'm like, I'm not surprised that I don't know the answer offhand,
Yeah.
but like I'm pretty sure I expected. I definitely was informed, actually, now that I think about it,
Okay.
because I emailed them for follow up, like
Hmm.
on some like issues of ETH transfer, which were
Hmm.
totally amended and more. But I was like following up and just dropped it, and then also there was kind of like a pseudo second round that didn't happen, but there was like a submission or something.
Hmm.
So it was all kind of in the blur of 2017 crypto memes
Yeah.
and
I mean,
art, and just submitting things and just again hearing like random things from different people and just throwing out the numbers game, filling out forms and drawing like what other strategy is there. um and so I just feel really like, of course, honored and lucky and blessed to hopefully be in a position that's like positive with drawing, when I know that so many artists are not. And that's what I hope like the lesson can kind of be, with Curio being like one of the earliest on a few different fronts, but hopefully on a artistic and community front. Like, how can NFTs or whatever digital artifacts acronyms are used, like how can artists be supported, and in a broader sense than just like career artists, a few of them making like a ton of fiat or taco value, just in terms of taco units of edible foodstuffs? How can people be supported to just do art? And to be honest, that's what I haven't seen occur with NFTs now, but it's exciting that there is excitement around it. And I hope that we can see a future where it's not just like the earliest or the ones with like large pre-existing support bases, where these digital tools can actually be used for supporting artists in a more diffused way.
Yeah, that was one thing that I thought was interesting, like about Rare Pepes in particular, is that um it's the first project that I know of where it basically allowed submissions from anyone. Like you don't even have to be quote unquote a good artist. You can have just mimi or interesting art, but they also had really good art too. But it allowed anyone to participate in this decentralized project that got published. And but the other thing that was interesting to me about that is, as a model too, it was non-custodial in the sense that the artists got their cards accepted, and that was it. They didn't have to sell any of their cards. They could keep them all. They could sell them all. They could sell them for whatever they wanted, or not sell, or trade them. It was a really interesting community model. And Curio is just like I see that as just again, I guess, more of a serious art project, maybe you could say. A different model, since it was more centralized, but definitely one of the, I mean, Curio it's like the second model kind of similar to that I had heard of, right? So very early in this whole aspect of art collections and governance and coordination, within the online space. And like you're saying, back in 2017, the amount of altcoins and scams and pump and dumps. I mean, it truly was a wild west. ICOs. It was really wild times.
Yeah, a few other notes on that. So, as far as I understand, Curio card contracts are modified ERC20s. So that's again, not knowing the super technical Solidity details. Curio is cited in the standard for one of the ERCs that are later used, like 721 or 1155. One of them.
721. Yeah.
Okay, yes. So as part of what later becomes one of the very influential NFT standards that helps that latter explosion in excitement, and then we're still developing on many fronts. And again, I hope that the positives can outweigh the negatives and the risks, because it's a fine line to walk no matter what digital systems are in play, and it's always going to be like some mixture. So what's the mixture that's going to actually like support artists and scientists is just the two small perspectives that I'm familiar with today. And I hope that we can just be part of like communities and ecosystems where people of just many different roles can balance each other. We can find a coordination mechanism where it's not just artists being supported, but insert other role. But through Curio and through the developments in the space, I've taken an interest and learned a lot, and seen different things with art. So that's what's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too about, like you said, not just art, but other aspects of society will have different financial models and different ways of making sustainable, I guess DAOs are probably the easiest way to put it, but just different ways of organizing and monetizing things, and supporting the recognizing the value for different things that people bring to the table, for sure.
Yeah, just a few pieces on that where I would hope if someone's curious, they could like learn from those who can say it so much deeper and better. But public goods and natural capital and life cycle analysis of ecological impact on blockchain systems and meta governance processes. There's a lot of areas that could be really important if they can translate and scale, as we've seen the ERC20 and the following waves bloom in the technical space. But things are moving towards the artistic and the public and the civic oriented. And so some of those changes just need to develop, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, at the extreme, I see, I one of the things we've seen over the last, 6 years, 7 years, is kind of an erosion of trust in a lot of public institutions and even public voting, for a lot of different reasons. And I would hope and imagine that at a certain point we'll reach a point where we have a cryptographically verifiable system on a public blockchain to avoid these types of issues going forward. Otherwise, one of the things that, just like currencies, one of the things that destroys a government is lack of trust. any system of organization, right? So yeah, it's interesting. Tons of possibility there. I don't know. It's really fascinating.
One note on that. I don't know if this is true in all places at all times, but just some thought or fact that I heard was that more value is stored in non-fungible items in the real world, four-dimensional space that we're in. Like more money is in car, houses, other real estate, physical art, physical collectibles. Those kinds of non-fungible items hold most of the value and attention and function in the world pre-computers or pre-crypto. And it would totally make sense for things that aren't exchangeable on today's type of centralized exchange. Those types of things could reflect, like as we've seen with domain names, those are the one and only something something .eth, and so those take on value. And if there's limited positions in a governance mechanism or in some other influence or decision making, those will come to have value. Can those exist out in the open, and how will they be exposed along different fronts? And as we've seen with just in so many ways, like any interface is a possible failure surface, and that just plays out in these wild ways in the DeFi space, but also in probably other areas that just haven't been explored as much leading up to when we're having this conversation. So yeah, blockchain and whatever it's going to be in the future, we don't know.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I guess we can dig into this and we can circle back around to your cards in a second since we're already talking about it. This in the last year we've had some extraordinary happenings in the blockchain space in terms of how assets and funds are managed and interacting with other systems. One of the first ones that really caught my attention was Solana is another blockchain that they started a project called Wormhole to bridge assets back and forth between Solana and other blockchains like Ethereum. And they recently had a vulnerability that was exploited that drained, I want to say it was between 200 and 500 million dollars worth of Ethereum at the time it was exploited. We've had and as we're talking today, we just this week we had Luna's system of US, what is it, UST? I forget their ticker, but their stable coin essentially, and their mechanism for maintaining a peg to the dollar was systematically attacked and broken. And at this point, it looks like it's probably dead for good, especially considering the trust in that and that their mechanism to maintain the peg. And that was billions of dollars that were, that were at risk, and people have lost a lot of money using that, not just individuals but foundations and whatnot. So it's it's interesting to see that, in the case of that Wormhole, again, that was a centralized, like a single set of contracts that, it only took one vulnerability for someone to find and exploit to drain that. And the economic incentives are there, and it's like the more value you have centralized in a single thing, whatever it is, the incentives and the consequences just go up exponentially. So I don't know, it's interesting to see how these things play out.
Yeah. How to design high reliability decentralized organizations, keeping in mind all the different types of decentralization, kind of like Vitalik's classic article with different types of decentralization, the protocol, and so on, like where the power is and who can control the code. That's what makes me think about decentralized systems in nature, like the ants. So that, from a scientific angle, provides us just an analogy to distributed computer systems, which is kind of invoked in the description of the Curio Cards, which starts with inspired by brains, ant colonies, and other complex systems, and then talks about how blockchain is related to those kinds of systems. So there's so many amazing connections to explore with different kinds of decentralized systems. It's not a topic for maybe all to work in, but it's a super fascinating topic to think about. And the conversations with people who work in different decentralized systems, which is kind of all systems to some extent, it just brings out the most interesting harmonies and resonances between their ways of thinking and doing. So I've really just come to know and want to learn more about decentralized systems as ways to talk about how to work with the function of systems as they are, whether they're computers or ant colonies, and less with like a potentially centralized, simpler notion, or sort of seeing that potentially centralized notion as simpler, when what would really be simple would be like the simple rules that give rise to a ledger with integrity, or the simple rules that give rise to a drawing. Like, just to and give one last note on that about the simple rules, that's pretty much the approach I take to at least 24, 25, 26 art, is just start like from making one of a certain pattern, like in the case of 24, like starting from the center and just sort of drawing out and padding it with the little vertical dashes, which after making the first 10, it's just a question of time on the page. And then 25, similar, drawing one shape in the center, one curve, and filling it in, and then just picking one pattern, repeating the triangle shape. And then 26, making multiple passes without also a final design in mind, just the grid, and then just completing different passes, one different modification at a time. So that's a generative approach to art, and I learned a lot along the way, especially from generative drawing with other people, but also learning from generative practices that were in different domains.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you said, you used kind of a generative approach to your card, the art that you used in your cards, but they definitely have distinct looks, and you can interpret them in different ways or see different things in them. When I look at 26, it like one way you could interpret that is almost like individual, like half pyramids, or half of an octahedron, if you like put perspective to it, right? I always thought that was interesting how that you could look at it that way as well.
Yes, cool interpretation. Also, comparing 24 and 26, they both feature tetrahedral motifs. So like in 24, one of the ways, looking at, for example, the near the number on the top left side, the solid triangle and then the dashed line, that is a common representation of like a tetrahedron, a four-pointed system with the fourth point coming off or doing something else on or off the page. And then in 26, there's a lot of similar designs with different triangles and potentially kind of tetrahedral, or like you pointed out, the four-sided base pyramid, the half of an octahedra. And so that sort of geometric repetition is one way to make drawings. And I've seen people who totally don't consider themselves artists, alone and in groups, make some of the most amazing art. People who just, oh, I'm just doodling in my notebook, but it is so like people taking sketches in class, doing realist drawings in class. I've seen many times, and people have shared and we've exchanged drawings, and then to be able to draw together and like mix generative formats, which my partner and I, my wife and I, wrote a paper in 2018. It was called partner pen play in parallel, aka PIP, PPPIP. So that setting of multiple people drawing, 24, 25, 26 are like just me drawing, but a high fraction of the art, not on my Flickr, but just in life, is drawing with other people. And there's many periods where that was far more frequent than solo drawing because it's just a convenient way to chill. And when people are able to mix their generativity, like in a conversation, in this linear layered way, and yes, in music and improvisation, also in that synchronous, linear, additive way. But with a drawing, there can be rotation and switching of the pens and just a shared attention and a shared co-creation. And it can be a space for having conversation, which is recorded through as much or as little as you want on the page. And there's just, it's a really rich setting. And so through that, I've just also balanced it with a more simple and, I guess, straightforward generativity of one person drawing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I bet it leads to some I don't know, a bit probably a different flow when you're working with someone else too.
Yeah, I mean, as different, I guess, as having a conversation with somebody who you know not well at all, or kind of, or very well, and talking to yourself,
Yeah.
playing chess against yourself.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, and I guess one more thing is so you submitted these three pieces of art. Did you submit the name at the same time too, or did you choose the name? Like, how did you come up with choose to name these pieces?
Well, earlier we talked about how when there's any amount of like language or even symbols sometimes on the page, it induces a very different mode of interpretation. So when the drawing has text on it, or it's like a specific symbol, then I don't really even think all the time about the drawings having names.
Mhm.
And I'm not super because it's just about the drawing, not totally the title. But sometimes the title is an opportunity for a pun. In the case of the text, like I was just saying, it could be an opportunity to clarify the text that might be hard to read, or structure how the person reads the text. And then for the abstract drawings, like the Curio ones, I sometimes think about trying to hold the space without the word. So in that sense, any title, without going into the sort of John Cage empty title, etc. meta critique, just to pick a simple evocative term that could be a standard dictionary word for somebody who wanted to relate an idea to their own experience, like complexity and passion and education. And then also, I think there are deep areas to explore and think about what's been generalized and what do others think about these issues? How does one develop on those own issues? And then there are also areas of like work and learning and service. So they're positive, deep, but also hopefully accessible words. And then to kind of connect them to maybe the structure of the drawing, or just to give one take. Also, I'm not like, I like just looking at the drawing, taking a look at it when, because I've had multiple, as one could imagine, conversations about what are in the art. And so I don't take too serious of an interpretation of any of them ever. It's past. It was passed to me when the drawing was finished, and then it was out of my inbox when I scanned it and uploaded it to Flickr for all the drawings that take a lot of time. And then like the NFT kind of brings another level or another layer of like finality, because it was after the scan was made when the NFT was made on Ethereum. So and then at the really small scale, it's like each box or each section of 25 is done when it's done. And so that is all, I guess, just some random thoughts on what the title and the structure of the art are like. But, and then if I could just add, without hopefully going on too long of a rant here. So 24 is complexity, and complexity is patterns across systems and how simple rules can create complex outcomes. So I look at 24 and I think like it does look complex, but also it has very simple rules. There's kind of the tetrahedral theme, just trying to make the same thickness of the solid line, except maybe in the few in the middle, and then just doing the fourth tetrahedral point with the dots, and then padding everything in the little islands with the circles, and then padding everything else with the squiggle, and then just repeating motifs and making it kind of elusive of a larger whole. But I didn't have to draw the part that's not on the page. So it has a broader sense of challenge and complexity, maybe even you could say, than actually just sort of seeing that the completion of complexity on and off the page is part of one's relation with the stimuli. And that's kind of like complexity science, and that's a whole area. And then 25, uh, it makes me notice how the left hatches, downward pointing triangles. The left, like 20%, is a little bit larger than the rest of the patterning, which is relatively consistent. And then also it's a total different background than kind of figure and ground, if one could say that, than this center piece unfurling. And it speaks to passionate unfolding, which on a family friendly podcast can only go so far, but it's kind of like a sprout and the passion that it seeks for coming out of the ground, which I hope is a positive interpretation of that heterogeneity in hatch size, because it would have also looked very cool if it was consistent or more consistent. So that's it, to me, without going too meta, is an example of narrativizing to re-understand what I also could and many times do perceive as a mistake. And when I look at them, and anyone who looks closely will see many sort of physicalities of the pen, like a blur, or just where it is like a blob, and just the challenge of maintaining a consistent shape size or hand, because it's way longer to complete a pattern than potentially even one sitting. So how to maintain a regime of attention and action, but then also not be too harsh with one's passion when there's like mistakes in the past. And then in 26, education, 26 definitely has a rigidity or like sort of arrangement to it and orderliness, and it is about repetition. And how does education have structure but also have openness, and also seem like it's going on beyond one unit, like it's kind of like an infinite field of this fractal shape, kind of like education, because each cell is only going to contact the teachers and the collaborators and the peers like around them, but maybe there's broader propagation of like a physical force or some information or something.
Interesting. Yeah, and I know we briefly touched on your process for how you've how you've done different styles and different ways of doing art. But for these pieces, these wouldn't have been like, these probably would have taken more than one sitting, right? To complete, because I'm just looking at the detail in these pieces. It's hard to imagine you being able to complete that in an hour.
No, this is definitely the younger, more time dedicated artist back then, and I would estimate between 20 to 30 or 40 hours, but also not always in super dedicated settings.
Mhm.
So sometimes just chilling, listening in class, don't know what year exactly or what class, or just at a cafe or eh, fixed environments, class, cafe, home. They're good for drawing higher precision drawings, but then also there's sort of like a moving train where you couldn't have as high of a precision, but more of the natural variability of that like place to sit and draw can be just reducing the precision of the drawing and opening up different ways of drawing that don't rely on precision. So lest someone think that like portrait drawing be only about making the perfect photoreal portrait. Like there's the whole continuum of evocative, and then I just think about how just with drawing, which is the one media again that I'm most familiar with, how just the physical aspects of the environment, especially the social, if it's going to be a group drawing, how that like ends up on the page, and then how that page is like the bottleneck that in the future people can interpret, but it kind of projects down onto the page, I guess gets bottlenecked when it gets minted, and then from there it can it's copied to people's computer, it's on IPFS nodes, it's in the memosphere, it's in part of the broader narrative of like historical NFTs, which is like super interesting. You know a lot more about like the rare Pepe, but just learning about that mechanism is interesting. So just like it's just part of an interesting format and time for digital art, which yeah, I think is only so recent of a format, but for it to be evolving in its cultural and technical aspects so fast, I think just at a historical um, way is quite unique for art.
Yeah, and your art is very interesting too because um, it's some of the earliest art on or probably the earliest art on Ethereum that's hand drawn. Most of the other art that I've seen, I mean, Curio being the first art on Ethereum is was done digitally, and yours is actually pen and paper and then scanned in, which is still unusual to see. You don't see a lot of that in the NFT space, or I haven't seen a lot of that. So it's definitely interesting to see too from that perspective as well. But I like your analogy of kind of like the way I'm, it sounds like you're almost really the medium capturing capturing the influence of the environment in the work as well. So that's an interesting perspective too.
Cool. Yeah, it would be definitely big if true if these are some of the first scanned drawings or just representations of ink. It's the media that I like. So that would be awesome and chill. And I hope um, something interesting for people to think about. And yeah, the drawing is a cool format. And it is interesting that you still see it more digital art. It's convenient and it's also incredibly beautiful. And there's so many styles and ways to do it.
Yeah, for sure. And you briefly touched on like the rediscovery of Curio Cards last year, and you'd kind of forgotten about it. I mean, I mean, there's been a lot of milestones with Curio Cards too already. We had Curio Cards sold in really like one of the first times that and some big auction houses that auctioned off NFTs. Curio cards were featured, at Sotheby's and Christie's. How has the whole rediscovery of curio cards and your art kind of, how has that affected you, or what's your interpretation of all that?
Good and important question. I think it's only however many months. 14 months or however many into that many chapters into hopefully a very long story. So just like the paper or the blockchain, it's hopefully about like always even thinking forward and just trying to improve where we all go together, because the drawings are on chain. Again, I release them once when I draw and finish it. Every pen mark is like releasing or removing responsibility from further action in that area. Again, you could add more, but you're done with that area to that extent. And then scanning it is moving it away from interpretation, because I just put it up, and if people see it and interpret it, then that's up to them. And again, I don't have a strong feeling or stability on the interpretations. And then it's been quite interesting to be put in this way into the NFT and art space, because like the financial side and other sides, it's like totally not my life as an insect biologist and community organizer. So it has been a big learning experience, and I'm just really lucky and feel honored again that I can be supported. But also, I was in a livable situation that Curio has also helped support, hopefully, others and support good ends financially. And I was already doing live streams and used to science communication and science discussions, including the recorded type. Um, so I guess in a weird way, it didn't change too much. It didn't change my job or um, way of living vastly. The part that on the art side I've really enjoyed a lot, among just so many others, like of course working with the Curio community and the incipient DAO and learning and being involved there, and then requests and having people make requests for drawings and doing drawings that take like 10 to 20 minutes or 30 minutes. They're fun to make. Several of them can be made in an hour. Sending it to them as a gift and just seeing people feel happy and appreciative of the art has been awesome, because that has never been the case. So I just like the sort of ability to utilize something that's important to somebody with opportunities that I have to just make simple art. And instead of sitting down at the blank page and being like, well, you know, there's the state logos, there's every word in the dictionary of every language. There's a lot of options for what to draw, or just start with something like a nucleus and just extrapolate from there, which is fun sometimes too. But actually to engage with people who will, whether they get the NFT, the one of one of this drawing or not, like some people want it, some people just want the physical. Some people want to display it, some people it's just a special message for them. So that's been totally different in the last year of drawing than before. And yeah, I'm just really appreciative of that, and that's been quite different, I guess. Even though it feels like life is changing in so many ways in the last 10 years or whatever, that it's hard to even see sometimes. But that has been a big change.
Yeah, I know. I was really excited. I got one of your one of ones, last year. That was really cool.
Yeah, and also being able to send signed photographic prints to people who don't hold any of my specific cards. That's awesome, because it's just like a total gift, which I hope as long as people are listening to this, they can request like totally free or some fair way to do it if it ever became actually popular. But it's just a free, tiny physical token of appreciation that anybody could request to get like signed prints of these drawings. Just if they like the art and they like the cards, then why not just get some physical cards, hopefully sent to you for free. I'm 5% trepidatious about sharing such an offer on a the number one podcast of all time in the historical NFT space. But I feel like if that's happening, then it will be totally fair to print them up.
I thought it was pretty bold to put that out there, to be honest.
Well, I kind of just thought of it as like, yeah, if that many people want it, then great for Curio. Or
Yeah,
if people love art, then share it responsibly and just interpret it and make it meaningful. And it it would be a tiny price to pay for being able to have art that's meaningful to people, and not just, I hope, for like my own perception. It's meaningful at the highest level when it's meaningful for somebody and they don't even need to tell me. So
yeah, yeah, Curio Cards has been a really it's been a really awesome project to be involved with. Let's well, let's talk about there's another huge facet to you. You're a very highly educated and trained scientist that's doing some really interesting stuff there too. Let's talk a little bit about your interest on the science side.
okay, awesome. Well, I'm an insect biologist or an entomologist, and the insects that I've studied over the years, I guess I'll first describe just sort of the insect side, and then let's talk more about like um, online teams and Web3 and all of this area. So, but first, just on the insect side. So, in undergraduate, I studied fruit fly genetics. And then in graduate school, I studied ant behavioral genetics. And that entailed going to southern Arizona in the US and doing a lot of field work and observing a lot of ants, capturing a lot of ant foragers, doing molecular analyses on ants and um, all kinds of ant learning and certain kinds of ant modeling. And then I finished my PhD in 2019. And since then, now it's 22, have been continuing to work on insect genetics as a postdoctoral researcher. So that's been the last 10 plus years of, to varying proportions of time and different activities being involved with basically insects and genetics.
That's a,
Anything you want to talk about on that side?
I was just going to say it's fascinating to me as an outsider. Try and map out the relationship between like ants and are an example of and bees. Like they have like these very complex systems of behavior, but in a collaborative or a community sense. So it's interesting to hear about research being done to me in that field, but also to hear that um, I know that you mentioned before that part of what's being done in the field right now is even just mapping the genome for some of these different insects that hasn't been, like until recently hadn't been done. What was it? The human genome was finished being mapped in what, like, I want to say it wasn't the 90s, right? Off the top of my head. So it's
It's been a
interesting.
continuum of progress, but yes, in about 2001, and also the first ant genome was 2011, and now there's maybe 100 on the order of ant genomes, and soon hopefully there'll be many more. So in the last 10 plus years, there's been just an explosion of genomic information in the insects. So that's been really interesting to kind of learn bioinformatics as that has been evolving and transforming the way that people study insects generally, especially outside of like the fruit fly, which has the longest history of genetics and kind of biology research. And now some of those methods are in the last several years being applied to other insects. So that's kind of one interesting angle. And then one more point was um, on the collective decision making side. So it's very easy to believe that one nestmate ant forager or one bee or termite, that it doesn't know things like how many seeds does the colony have, how much food does it need for the winter, what's the probability of this foraging risk like a drying out or getting predation. So it's like, yeah, of course the nestmate is not doing that computation. So that is what authorizes or or facilitates studying the ant colony as like this emergent decision maker. Whereas sometimes when it looks like the entity is kind of a singular entity, like a squirrel or something, there's a sense in which it's modeled as integrating many factors and making decisions. Whereas in the nestmate case, it's easier to see how colony functions, like obtaining food or forgetting to forgetting a past trail that's no longer relevant and moving to a new trail. Like those kinds of cognitive functions are always explained by appeal to what the nestmates are doing and their limited cognition. And one can also take that sort of a decentralized systems perspective for the squirrel and think about how each element of its sense and its cognition and then its action, how each element is like decentralized. So it's not that we can't study squirrels using this approach. It's just that in the ants, that is playing out at a spatial and a temporal scale that is right in front of us. Like you can
Mhm.
put something on the ground and the ants are swarming it, and then this changes and you can test it and it plays out. So that's what's something very interesting about ants.
Yeah, there's the it like with a like a mammal like a squirrel that's there it's got a lot more going on to where it's a lot simpler with an ant. There's probably I would imagine it's probably fewer variables that you would have to track than trying to anticipate the how the squirrel's going to react, that type of thing too, right?
I guess that is like kind of what is the behavioral repertoire of a squirrel? What
Hmm.
is the behavioral repertoire of an ant nestmate?
Okay, yeah.
And maybe they have similar, or maybe the squirrels can do like different, like complex vocal sounds. Though maybe some ants do also use some sounds. And then the squirrels modify their niche. Different squirrels, I'm sure, do it differently, digging food and things like that. And
Hmm.
different animals modify their niche to different extents. But then with the ants, that's one of the other fascinating aspects is just the extent to which they modify their surroundings with basically nest architecture and just quite literally the depths they dig in the desert and the lifestyles that enable living through like thunderstorms and monsoon rains, but then long dry periods and hot and cold, and just the way that the insect body and decision making apparatus does that is amazing in many different environments in the world.
Yeah, and you have such a, like you said, there's such a rich variety of just ants across the world. I know I've seen in the desert in the Mideast, they have these like long leg ants that they kind of, it's almost like it almost looks like they're on stilts because it gives them the ability to be further the main body further off the scorching hot desert, so they don't get nuked by the heat.
And,
There's so many interesting adaptations.
yep, and just to kind of give one note, I would be remiss not to like mention the specific research on ants that I'm doing, which is just how you mentioned like a morphological adaptation or potential like method of succeeding in that given niche. Maybe it doesn't work in the rainforest, but it's like very effective in the desert. So that's one example of potentially how ants in their bodies and behavior are able to enact these decentralized algorithms to different ecosystems, like what works in the desert behaviorally, morphologically, And then the level that I'm studying now is also thinking like, what is the adaptation at the level of the tissue specific gene expression that is facilitating that collective behavioral algorithm? So now that is like perhaps technical for some, but it basically amounts to measuring the gene expression of each tissue in the ant or some tissues. So, like the brain, the midgut, the ovary, the antenna, different parts of the brain. So, those are different tissues, and they all have the same DNA in their cells, the same genome. Like in the case of a worker ant and a queen, without going into too many details, they
Mhm.
basically have the same diploid genome, like two copies of each chromosome, but different tissues within the nestmate have different expression patterns. And then also there are kind of systematic expression differences in the same tissue from ants that are in different life stages or doing different behaviors. And so just like we could study kind of the way that, well, maybe leg length is associated with a temperature, and then that would be like a evolutionary explanation for the evolution of the leg morphology in North America or something. Like
Mhm.
another kind of interesting way to study that adaptation would be by studying this gene expression at the tissue level.
Yeah, interesting. I was even thinking while we were talking too, I mean, you're talking about having, like, the more ant species we have mapped, do you know what size the like for example an ant genome is in terms of data? I mean, is that we
Yes, okay. So for reference, the human genome is commonly said to be around like 3.3 billion bases of
okay.
DNA long. And the number of chromosomes can vary across different animals. So this is just reporting like the total size of the whole genome in terms of its like around its length. And
Hmm.
then ant genomes and are kind of within the insect genome range. And definitely there's review papers for people who want to know the details, but they're within the range of like a few hundred megabases. So
Hmm.
they're like 10% the size of the human genome around there. And but also like genome size doesn't correlate simply with body size or with like perceived complexity of cognition. There's single cell creatures with just massive genomes, much larger than humans. So that's been one of, I guess, the surprising findings as more and more genomes have been sequenced. It's like, whoa, genome size can change a lot within ants. Sometimes these genome
Interesting.
duplications are just like runaway and they lead to just bizarre consequences, and they can kick off some big evolutionary transitions. And then like there's a lot more to say, but that's kind of a fun area. But it's an NFC podcast. This is deep down the gene expression rabbit hole. But these are like the fun things that we get to talk about, work on.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing that just occurred to me too is that you can have, the length. I know, like viruses, they can add essentially DNA that doesn't get expressed later on, and after that's cleaned up too. So that can alter that stuff too. Um, if I understand that correctly, I'm
It's
not an
like
expert, obviously.
we could continue talking about the viral insertion of DNA.
Yeah, but
Interesting
you know,
topics. But yeah,
yeah.
totally, totally
Well,
another
well, what I
time.
was just thinking when we were talking about that, what I was thinking is, it'll be interesting is we're getting, much better computing power and different types of computing power and analysis. I think it'd be really interesting to see as more and more of these, like just in a like ant species get mapped out their genome, to where I'm sure that there'll be ways or methods of analyzing, maybe doing analysis across all of these different genomes and looking for like the correlation with different behaviors and, like you said, different morphologies and stuff. I think that'd be interesting too to see how that, you know you might see some, like, get some surprises just from the analysis that way too.
This is an amazing idea. It's totally the direction that would be exciting to travel down. I hope even in the future that I can continue to study what you just said. Like it'd be the science question, that we'll have many lifetimes of work to do on, which is what are the genomic and the epigenomic and the transcriptomic, like gene expression, like what are all of the everythings in ants and how are they associated with nestmate and collective behavior? What gene families are doing this in this tissue, in this cast, in this context? There's so many interesting things to learn. So I hope that, just like you said, with the computational advances, we can work on scalable approaches. So when new genomes come in, we can just like drop them in the folder and then rerun the analysis and update our common best understanding of the relationships between genome structure and like ant traits. People can add ant traits. We just update the analysis. And then that could engender a new way of like working and sharing information, valuing contributions to the scientific literature. Maybe somebody is in an area where there's an important ant to sequence and it's worth it to collect that ant and have that person verify it and be included in the doing of science. Those are some pretty, just like everything else we've been exploring, like pretty amazing ways, but in the science context to combine like attention, value, contribution, open science. So it's cool to think about ants. And then again, the connection with like the computer systems. Okay, then what? Cool analogy. And then what? Shared modeling languages? Using decentralized web systems to study ants? What is the next step?
Yeah, well, the other thing I was thinking too is that it would actually be easier the more data sets you have, because looking at just one genome, it's like you don't have a control essentially. So the more different genomes you have to compare, it would be easier to actually, with the right modeling, analyzing software, whatever, right? Like it would theoretically, at least in my head, it'd be easier to actually then tease out like what each part of the genome is actually responsible for, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like as you increase the sampling density of species, you could like detect genomic changes at a finer and finer scale. Like if you
Yeah.
sequenced 100 from the same field site of the same species, you'd be looking at differences associated with that population. And then if you pulled back to like one just genus and you sampled densely, that would be a certain evolutionary time that you could resolve changes. But the challenge, and from the computer perspective, is some of these algorithms might like have a storage requirement or a computation requirement that's like the number of genomes squared. So
Mhm.
then it becomes challenging to run these analyses. But hopefully, there are even now, but in the future too, more incremental approaches that could help resolve like ant phylogenies as hundreds or thousands are considered by researchers using non super quantum computers or whatever they're using, but something that people could actually access. So there's a few cool areas there.
Yeah, we can get more into some of the other D science too, but I would imagine that one of the cool things that, or beneficial things I would hope to see in the future is, for researchers like yourselves to have some sort of shared computing model to where researchers can access these, extensive computing power that they need for pure research, where instead of having to go out and try and, like, I don't know, beg for funding, or I don't know, find someone to let you do it or whatever, trying to actually buy the hardware. So
It totally brings us to DeSci,
yeah.
decentralized science, and that shortening English letters being used now, but its relationship with past and other contemporary and future science gestalts for just evolution and improvement and development on the frontier of research and teaching and service, which is some of the missions of, for example, a university, but then also reimagining what science could be in some future or distal or proximal future moments. Like, how could we start increasing the accessibility and the transparency of science, or the rigor or the integrity of the data sets, or um, highlighting the ways that people are building on each other's work through like recommendations or just acknowledging different kinds of work and labor in the scientific process. There's many like short and hopefully long-term developments in how we do science. And maybe blockchain's a long time word that people use, Web3, Web4. Those are just even some basically hashtag slash memes, English words. And it's about the show, not the tell. But the keyword is really important. That's like the title of the drawing type
Mhm.
status. Like complexity is important for connecting people who want to learn about complex systems. DeSci for now is important for connecting those who want to learn about decentralization of all these different kinds and learn from some of the best and emerging practices in other like D asterisk areas, DeFi, finance, and governance, and bringing some of what's working and resilient in those areas into the scientific context where there are certain challenges that are able to be addressed really effectively and some that are just not even remotely there with today's um, technology on like a blockchain perspective or even any digital technology for certain tasks. But that's always been sort of the work of knowledge management and research, is to be on the frontier of like collecting new information and synthesizing and integrating and annotating. And so there have been many informational revolutions. One that I guess can be said is ongoing in science for the last long period of time. But there's been a ton of changes in science, like with preprints over the last decades, and the way that that has enabled changes in who's publishing and about what and how. Just the full research stack is evolving, and it was different for the previous generations and who is doing science and what they're doing and how it's being funded and how it's being assured. Those will continue to change. And again, I just think of DeSci as hopefully being something positive that people can start to swarm and contribute and build around, just like there have been other really positive movements like open science and focusing on accessibility and inclusion in science and citizen science.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different aspects to what I would consider DeSci. Like you kind of touched on, one aspect is even really like the the record itself. Like we have these efforts now underway that are technically illegal in the Western space, but they've people have been essentially sharing all of these scientific research papers for free on on torrents online in order to allow people, researchers, and those who need access to the data who can't afford to subscribe to a journal or pay for an article, allow them access to this data. I think that's a really an important development. And you know, I, I know that's again, it's not technically legal, but I think that's definitely a way forward. I don't think that someone's economic status should prevent them from being able to access this data. But like you said, the other aspect too is even like the scientific process itself. But I mean, another aspect that occurred to me too is ensuring that we have this irrefutable record of what's been done, and maintaining the integrity, because we've seen this politicization of science over the last at least going back to 2000 and earlier too, to make sure that we don't have the science itself and the interpretation of that corrupted by political goings on, right? I mean, we need to maintain the integrity there so we can keep moving forward.
Yeah, these are super important questions. And what were the challenges and opportunities on all of those fronts for centralized systems? And what are some of the timeless as well as like the sort of just of the moment challenges for decentralized systems that we also want to have those functions? And just to kind of unpack that like timeless versus like just in the moment, Like the timeless challenges in decentralized systems might include like information propagation and trade-offs with, for example, like the cost of operating versus the cost of starting, the cost of stopping, the threat of rupture. And on these areas, my PhD advisor, Professor Deborah Gordon, she's totally led the way in thinking about ants from that perspective. Um, I guess I don't know what else to say. We need to work on those kinds of systems and keep the timeless, and then also the sort of ways that the situations that are going to pop up day to day and the super specifics are going to come into play. And it's going to be a show not tell. It's an infinite game.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the DAO thing. Like ultimately, I think um, kind of like for DeSci too. I mean, I don't even necessarily think you have to have economic incentives for participation in the DeSci itself, at least in at a certain area or a certain level of development. We'll essentially have the reputation and the acknowledgement from their contributions, basically building up a reputation that will be its own currency in the sense that they'll get benefits, whether they're monetary or not later on, that will you know reward them for doing that.
Well, let me kind of explore that a little bit because within the decentralized finance, the DeFi space,
Mhm.
one might be familiar with like the architecture of kind of the pure pyramid scheme, pay it forward, every variant, not cast a judgment on them, but there's all these games that are played on chain that involve like money being passed around. So when we think about these DeSci systems that allocate attribution, and then how that kind of like social cred, first off, is actually scaffolded in the real world. Like, who actually cares about how many of something somebody has? What's the real world that cares about the on chain marker? And then where is value entering the system and how is it exiting the system? And how is that going to work through time? Like, well, if you start citing using this new science system, then you get, the kickbacks and the referral bonuses. And then it's like, okay, it's the
Oh
same
no.
questions that governance tokens have in the DAO, which is like, okay, so should the earliest papers continue to accrue? Or is there some cooldown? Or does it have some connection with people in the real world so that one person can only have one account? Like, these are the real questions that science has to be addressing. And in a world that's so complex and there's so much variation in like technology and education access, it's really important to like improve on high reliability systems and opt-in systems that are the most advanced along these areas, and then also have a massive focus on increasing using a lot of low-hanging fruit and opportunities that just every person should have access to certain aspects of this educational system. And that's like the D-School angle, which
Mhm.
is even newer and smaller than DeSci. But this is work that a lot of people at kernel community and others like Sid have been developing and have initiated, and it's starting to lead to a conversation in these past few months around DeSci and D-School, where it's like, well, when we're on the frontier exploring the unknown, that is science. But also there's a kind of space that science encloses or at least navigates paths through, that's like education. And it would be amazing for people of all ages to be involved in citizen science and participatory research and consensual information sharing and all of that research. But then also, most people for most of their life, including even professional scientists for most of their day, are engaged more like in learning and education and schooling. And so that is like DeSci kind of a bubble expanding out, but with and developing in parallel with different spatial metaphors, etc., is like DeSci with D-School. And hopefully that is the whole of society education and allowing people to opt into something that for example, could support or reward them for learning and teaching and mentoring and facilitating. But then to kind of close the loop, how do those systems work? And who's paying and supporting that? And then how does the value work for people in a global world? And so that's why it is like a bottom up solution that I hope will work, not like a sort of future utopian DeSci state, but those kind of aesthetics and preferences are important to cultivate too. But what I think will be really the work to be done in the coming years and ongoing for anyone who is interested and available will be to actually like build those DeSci systems.
Yeah, the education part is really fascinating too. It reminds me of an idea I had a while ago, and it's fascinating that I have these different, like in the legacy traditional education systems. There's a tremendous amount of corruption and waste, and when systems, complex adaptive systems, their primary goal is to ensure their own survival, right? Rather than actually doing whatever it is that we put the label on the box that they are, right? Um, you know, it,
Here,
it's
here, oh,
no, go ahead.
if I could just add one note on that, the ones that you see persisting through time will be the ones acting as if they are promoting their own survival. That's true of
Mhm.
evolution. It's true in active inference in the free energy principle. It's just like if something is not growing or stabilizing in size or extent through time, it is dissipating because the universe is like dissipating and entropy and all of that. So the
Mhm.
ones that are persisting through time are going to be implicitly and or explicitly acting in their own interest. It has to be that way.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, one thing I was like, we have all of these opportunities, like with the ability to publish and disseminate information and education online. You know, the thing, like, to think that we have these, like, countries like the United States and these other rich countries that are spending billions and billions of dollars on education, but no one has taken the step to basically create, like, for example, an online education platform um, that where the students, like, at least every few years they take a test that like can tell them their learning style, and then it will adapt the presentation of the material to their learning style, right? That type of thing. It seems like so basic, but we really haven't seen any adaptation like that it seems like a no-brainer to me, right?
Yeah, that's a really important and complex challenge. I would hope and just sort of, I guess, insert a little pre footnote here that there could be a certain type of consensual and ethical and transparent way to engage computer systems in learning in ways that are possible now that weren't possible before, like using active inference models. So there might be certain ways to represent teaching curriculum and material in a way where it gets like rendered and presented for the student, because with a textbook it's not possible to have that rendered differently for different students.
Yeah.
But with digital computers and new ways of storing the information and then also visualizing it and including cognitive models in the way that it's visualized, it could be possible for something to be displayed with the speaker's preferred language or in a font size that was highly accessible for them, or with the different mixtures of information presented in different orders. And that might be possible to do without any neural measurements or without any pupil tracking. Those things might be added in special contexts to provide like extra information, but there's so much that could be done with just like taking a really realistic look at remote learning and diverse students and just making it work for them and finding the framework that generalizes across that. Because I totally agree, there's been so much attention on it, and we don't have some basic remote education platforms outside of like specific contexts.
And I guess the other thing that occurred to me too, while we were talking about this whole subject of DeSci and DeFi, I mean DeSci and distributed education is, like there's an old adage in the I guess hacker community about like information wants to be free, and I think that that is really applicable here as well. You know, I ultimately I think that the more information we make available is ultimately going to be better, right?
Here's an interesting thought, like on that information wants to be free. It's like the information that's around, not the lost knowledge, like the books that have been lost, or the files or the parts of the internet that are totally not being saved, like any scale of data. Like the information that's around and continues to be accessible has been acting like it wants to be free, because free has been the way to get distribution in the way that the internet economy and system has been. What would happen if information wants to have like a respectable price? There's one William Blake quote. So William Blake was a English engraver and just artist who I've studied a lot, and I'm really a longtime student of his work. And I hope I don't misquote, but the words will all basically be there. Basically, in some letters, was talking about like a fair price, general demand, and good value. Maybe I'll look it up just so I'm not wrong, but basically, it's just like he was almost like predicting the NFT market. I am gonna look it up, even though this is total non podcast form, but it has to be done. But anyways, I'll say it afterwards. But it was like the way that he saw art as being of quality and in demand, like a population that respected the art, and it was a fair value that was supporting artists, was so interestingly put, even so early. So feel free to give me thoughts, and I'll find this exact quote.
Yeah, that's interesting. With NFTs, it's interesting that one of the criticisms early on was that you can right click save, and that you still can make infinite free copies, but it's really it's the provenance and the on-chain record and the of ownership that really is sets it apart too, though.
So here's the corrected Blake information. So he's writing in the margins of a book called Discourse by Reynolds, and he wrote, "We want a fair price and proportionate value and a general demand for art." Now, it just was powerful to me even before NFT, even before Curio, because it was like, that is an understated way to talk about, like, it's not the whole picture of a society, but a society where there's peace and support for art, but not just like we're printing debt and we're giving checks to artists, or like we have a state art committee. It's like there's a distributed system, which that localism is what, even though he lived in London, would have also basically, from our perspective, been engaged in. Like the idea that that would be fair for the person making the art and receiving the art, and that the value would be commiserate with the situation, and that there would be like general demand. Like there's general support for baseball. Like people like and respect that art, whether in that person's community or for some smaller subset of people at some higher fractal scale. Like there will still be more and less visible art. I think that's fair to say. But how could the whole ship fleet be floating with a general demand for art, rather than so many millions of USD for this one of one, and then this exclusive way of transacting, versus something that actually like supports generally artists in their situation?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I know that there's some DAOs out there that have been sprung up to support artists getting started even in the NFT space. Robeck mentioned that he's a member and supports the Weeb3 DAO, which helps artists like offset the cost of their first mint on Ethereum because it can be
I,
costly.
I feel like all of the Curio artists, at least all of those who are public, are between very and extremely involved. Like all of the work by Luis, Max also has spoken so much about onboarding people, but like in these different guilds around the world, that has been really like inspiring and eye-opening. And it's kind of like in science, some of the most inspiring stuff is when a career researcher, whether they had like a solo unconventional research life that never touched academia, or whether it's a total professor situation, but then they spend their time mentoring and onboarding and then increasing like the interactivity they have with people who are just getting in the game, which is going to be the case for education and science and art forever. So as long as we have pens and paper, people will be learning to draw. And as long as there's digital art, people will be thinking about onboarding and the practice and the embodiment of digital art too. So what can be our North Star in that world? And that's like, again, where I just returned to thinking like Blake's quote, where he's taking such a realist view on the relationship between the artist as producer and the communities that support them. And his life was very interesting because, first off, there's a ton known in certain ways and a lot of documents, but it was so much about the application and the amount of money that was each engraving was going for, and the living at like barely at sustenance levels for long times of his life, but also just creating the most like totally soaring poetry and engraving and other media masterpieces. And that's the whole question with how we could support more people so that we have just like a better thing happening.
Yeah, I mean it's a great question. I think we'd all like to see um I don't know, like you said, the feast or famine thing for artists is real. So, you know, I don't know. I'd love to see something, on a broader scale emerge there too.
Yeah, it's like science and art.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
both have some similarities with their economic valuation, their social valuation, and they both have this sort of infinite onboarding opportunity and challenge with people from all over the world onboarding to art and to research and science. And that's always been the case, but it's happening in a new digital way. So there's an opportunity on this in these early blocks of the digital, which might be some of the middle or later blocks of the digital or of this phase of the digital. Like there is an opening to have that distribution of inequality and just so many other issues at least be on the path towards becoming something that everybody can support instead of something that is just stabilized through dynamics that just retroactively are going to look not good at all.
yeah, for sure. And something else just occurred to me too that, and we were talking about the DeSci and whatnot. One of the things that I think is most heartbreaking is um, you know, at least going back to World War II, we have a tremendous amount of some of the best minds and manpower has gone towards work in the quote unquote defense industry, where a large portion of the work remains classified to this day, even going back to World War II, and really the public good that could be done by these. Well, one, just their R&D being public, but also the R&D that they were doing being directed towards things that actually would bring about the betterment of humanity instead of creating more advanced weapon systems. It's I
Well,
mean,
it's an area I only directly know very little of, but I guess my sort of North Star in that area would be Bucky Fuller talking about the transition from weaponry to livingry, also at that time in the like mid 1900s. And just like we have the aluminum factories, I have this house design that uses this much metal and it takes this much time to create and to move and to set it up, and here's the operating costs of it. Oh, it looks weird, or whatever other things hindered that transition and paradigm shift from happening. It was an ambitious one, but that pivot that is always possible, like that fractal nosedive basically that we're in, and the way that we have to be pulling out of it towards life and regenerativity and sustainability, but even going beyond sustaining, because this isn't just like we're trying to stay the same angle. So whatever that is going to look like, with that nexus of just like some of the areas that we've been talking about today, where like art and culture and communication and governance systems, but also research and education. I mean, there are a lot of the big topics. So I hope that we could sort of do them some justice. And for those who wanted to be having their own thoughts and development, I hope that like it comes across less as us understanding, or at least from my perspective, but hopefully the spirit of the conversation was like, we're in the middle of it, as always will be the case. And it's something where the artifact or like the experience or the transcript or whatever is a call to action. It's like an update of the cognitive model with a call for action of some kind, even if only mental action, because it's going to require a lot of action to maintain anything for all the reasons we've been talking about today.
Yeah, that's really well put. Yeah, like of course we don't have all the answers right now, but I do think, on all these fronts, it's definitely worth working towards.
What would be the most chill next, I don't know, era just for Curio, for the Curio verse? What would be a niche for us in the broader historical NFT space, which you're understanding much deeper?
Well, I mean, in Curio, I think being the first art collection on Ethereum, it's already got a like historically it already has like that's already recorded. But I think one thing that I think is fascinating is trying to maintain a positive and healthy community that is like has is of mutual respect and instead of like pumping and dumping or you know, win Lambo Moon, that type of thing. Yeah, there's some efforts in the DAO that are going on that I think is interesting too. I mean, that's kind of really a experiment and as well in the sense that trying to look for a way that we can support Curio Cards as a project and but also maintain like find a way to generate enough funding to maintain itself too. I don't know. It's interesting to see that evolve as well. I know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it makes me think about that progressive sealing in of the drawing, like sending it away with
Hmm.
each pen stroke and then scanning and then the NFT and then all of these, like everything just gets added on, and it's like further and further from the agency that somebody has over it, in terms of it being like further, the ship is further and further out. So then with Curio, even from the way that the team and like the vision and the context that it was arising out of was like about having this art show that just had so many firsts, but it's this subtle community grounding and like this decentralization, which like you also kind of spoke to a different vector into decentralization with the sort of even less structured approach of rare pepes. But Curio represents like this sealing in, but not of the art, like the sort of case that I've been talking about, but in this like community way the DAO, whatever happens with it, it will be on chain and off chain. That during the last however many months, these many you know curio fractions were distributed, or these communications were sent. um so we're just like now building in the social space because the art is sealed in, and also the even some of the history, the early history is sealed in too. So
It,
maybe some people think of themselves as like social builders or some other role, but we all in a way are, like, at least existing in that social construction, co-construction, and embodiment. And so I don't know if that gets too interpretive about Curio, but it seems like an opportunity to explore that building.
yeah, I mean, it's really just exploring all the different ways that we can launch off of that original set as the basis, you know. So it's interesting.
Yeah, like we had that 5 year stream just a couple days ago in Decentraland. There was like the watching and streaming and chatting with Travis and artists, and um, going over the cards. Different people saw new things in the cards, and for sure, I learned a bunch of random facts like minutia. We were zooming in on the cards and scrolling around, and like, where is it pixelated? It was getting like really funny and detailed. It was like we're just chilling, talking about art. People talking about other projects that are like other eras of art with similar themes and trends, and other kind of NFT and digital art projects that people had or had done on chain or off chain, other chains never saved. So it's just like we were chilling, talking about art, memeing, talking about tech. That was just super fun. And just to think that we've only known each other or been able to have that kind of a conversation for such a short period of time.
Yeah, it is really cool. I was able to attend the last half of that, and that was my first foray into Decentraland. But yeah, I mean, you know, when you look back, you know, crypto is still so young, and you know, just 5 years ago, we were like you were saying, we were in the middle of that huge ICO and altcoin pump and dump and all that stuff. I mean, we've definitely moved forward, but there's you know, it'll be interesting to see what the future is. I know we're in the middle right now of a, you know, little downturn in the crypto temporarily, but I long term I'm ultimately still just as positive about the future for the space as ever.
Yeah, I hope that like, there's never enough time in finite conversations to uh touch on every like important point, but I hope that we at least, and maybe in closing here, like touched on ways that there's so many domains like art and science being just some of them, where it can be more and different than just a number of USD that the last sale was multiplied by the total hypothetical supply. Like, that metric has dominated fintech, and
Yeah.
it creates a laser focus, and it feels like art NFTs too are under the shadow of like their price and all these other features, and DeSci is just starting, and D School even basically too. And I hope that we can have just more and different and better, so that it'll be like writing, like, oh yeah, they did it with cuneiform and it was about the double ledger, but then people ended up making materials that were transcending just counting numbers.
Well, I think you know, one thing that I think as we go forward with you know, into the future with the vintage NFTs in particular, is that we're going to, like, right now there's a lot of people that are flipping, and they buy because they see the opportunity to make money. But I see that there's going to be more people that like myself that are that are primarily buying as a just as a collect and hold thing, where you're going to be like, which is ironic because ultimately that's going to drive up the prices, is people that will not sell no matter what, like latch onto this stuff. It's just going to shrink the available supply. But I would hope that, or what I believe will happen, is we'll see more and more people that they're buying because they appreciate they appreciate the art, and they appreciate the significance for what they stand for, and what like the moment of time that they're really capturing. So that's what I see going forward too.
Well, I guess on with the next block, and I hope that I can return to your discussion space or vice versa, because it was a great discussion and hopefully not the end of it.
No, it was a real pleasure. It was great talking to you today. Well, thanks for joining us. I'll call it quits there.
All right, see you, Zero G.